we have a great panel to sort of top off what I think has been a terrific day. Of course, one of the themes that we've heard throughout these sessions and through each of the 4 regional assemblies has been the pervasive and powerful effect of globalization on the world order. The great transformation of the world economy with its shifting trade patterns, financial flows, the mass movement of people, and the rapid dissemination of technology and ideas has reshaped the international political system and spurred new calls for new rules, regimes, and reformed institutions. How can we assess the positive, negative, and as yet unknown effects of this world historical change? How can we measure the depth, width, and velocity of this phenomenon? This is something that came up, I think, in each of the 3 rooms today. What should be the institutional response to globalization? That, of course, is one of the core driving themes of this whole project. Who are the crucial new actors in this game? How are we to understand the rising sentiments against many aspects of globalization, both in this country and abroad? Our 2 distinguished guests have been thinking about these issues with greater seriousness and reflection, and for longer than just about anybody in the country. Deanna Farrell is in charge of perhaps the world's premier private sector organization devoted to thinking about the causes, scope, and consequences of globalization, the McKinsey Global Institute. And we've been very fortunate to have a number of fellows from McKinsey, both from MGI and from the larger company, and they've been some of our best fellows. Their research at MGI has identified key emerging issues of opportunity and concern before anyone else has. In the past few years, they've produced cutting-edge work on China's role in driving up world energy demand, sophisticated analysis of global financial markets, an assessment of the increased pressures on the public sector, and we're one of the first to identify the new power of sovereign wealth funds, to name just a few of the timely issues that they were ahead of the curve on. The work that Deanna and her team have produced has been enormously influential and insightful and has informed much of the structure of this project. Before taking over MGI, Deanna was a leader of McKinsey's Global Financial Institutions and Strategy practice. Previously, she worked at Goldman Sachs and received her MBA from the Harvard Business School. And in addition to her many other accomplishments and honors, Deanna is a member of the Next Generation Project Senior Advisory Board and has been one of the strongest supporters of the project from the very beginning. And for that, we owe you a real thanks. Our other guest, Richard Fisher, has also made his name on the frontiers of globalization during an extremely distinguished career in both government service and the private sector. As a Deputy United States Trade Representative, Richard negotiated trade agreements with countries ranging from Chile to Vietnam, oversaw the implementation of NAFTA, and helped bring China and Taiwan into the World Trade Organization. After leaving his position as Vice Chair of Kissinger Associates, Richard took over the Dallas Federal Reserve Bank, where he and his superb team have helped transform the way we think about inflation rates and national monetary policy in an increasingly open global economy. But for all these impressive accomplishments, I would argue that the most impressive thing that Richard has done has been to father this project. It was Richard, as chair of the American Assembly, who conceived of and energetically put together the initiative that has brought us here today. And for this, Richard, we owe you our greatest thanks.
Thank you.
Without you, we would not be here today. Now, what I suggest for our format is that Richard and Deanna give opening comments, and then perhaps we start a conversation, a dialogue between them, and then at an appropriate point, pull in the fellows and see if we can't get a lively discussion going. So without further ado, Richard.
Well, first I want to thank you for those kind words. I also want to thank David for helping us get this thing started through the American Assembly. The idea was to really take a fresh look at what's transforming our world and not be captured by the old mindset. And I'm going to personalize this a good deal because I think it's important to understand where all this gets started. And I'm going to give you 3, this is 3 in Texas. If you go to Texas A&M, this is 3.
After all that McKinsey training, you
That's
could
right.
feel good.
3 personal instances that I go back to that really sort of rivet this subject matter of globalization. One was in 1977. There were a couple of us that were picked to go to Berlin. The American Council in Germany had this Young Leaders Program. For some reason, I was singled out by the then mayor of Berlin named Richard von Weizsäcker. He became the president of Germany in their dual selection scheme that they have. And he took me into a corner of the mayor's office, which at that point jutted out over the wall because Germany was separated. And he put his hands on my back and he said, "Richard, I want you to imagine the unimaginable. Someday this wall will not be here. And the 17 dictatorships that compose the 27 nations of Europe will be democracies." I thought he was a little nuts. And then only 13 months later, by sheer happenstance, I was part of the team that went over to negotiate with Deng Xiaoping the normalization of relations between the United States and China. And I remember Deng Xiaoping came into the room at the Great Hall of the People. I was working for Michael Blumenthal, the Secretary of the Treasury. We had had all these little secret back-channel negotiations. And we were facing one way in the room, and suddenly you felt literally a jolt of electricity. He was a small man, 4 foot 7 inches tall. So, of course, we looked around, we heard this crackling voice, couldn't see him, then we looked down, there he was. And I haven't forgotten what he said, which is, "Where are these big American capitalists we should be so afraid of?" And then he uttered the famous phrase, which he later used and has been mistranslated, which is, "It doesn't matter if the cat is yellow or black, as long as you catch mice." And the third instance in personal history was what I call the two Steves, which was in 1975, and then perfected in 76, were Steve Jobs and Wozniak and the Apple computer. To me, that's the beginning of globalization. The wall came down on 11/9, as we like to say, November of '89. Mao died, thanks be to God. And China decided they would participate in the system. And then, of course, through the ether of the internet, we have become inextricably interlinked. You know that because of your generation. For my generation, that is a radical idea. And so now we are dealing with globalization. What is globalization? My favorite economist is one of the few economists that didn't come out of the English school, Joseph Schumpeter. He was a Czech who went through Germany and then came to Harvard for fear of persecution under Nazi Germany. By the way, quite a character. He had an incredible way of seizing a phrase. He called it creative destruction. When he walked into his first class at Harvard, by the way, he said he had told the audience in Sanders Auditorium, "I had 3 ambitions in life. One, to be the greatest economy in the history of the world, economist. Second, the greatest lover. And third, the greatest horseman." And he announced, "I haven't done well with the horses lately." And he was a genius economist. And he talked about creative destruction. And to simplify it, he used an example, which is the reason I'm mentioning this, which was the Transcontinental Railroad of the United States. If you wanted to ship something from San Francisco to New York in those days, before the railroad, it was $6,000 in then dollars, enormous fortune. It took 6 weeks. When you built the railroad across the country, it took 4.5 days, and it drove the cost down to several $100s. And he said that everything that was optimal before is no longer optimal when you build a railroad through virgin territory. China, the coming down of the wall, the internet are enormous Schumpeterian forces coursing across the global landscape. And creative destruction is upon us. And I think the challenge for you is to figure out how to channel it. I rarely compliment the French. And I extremely rarely ever compliment the current president of France, Sarkozy. He did say something interesting during his campaign, which was globalization like gravity. It cannot be defied. You have to figure out how to use it and how to channel it and how to master it. And I think that's really what globalization is all about. We have a political campaign right now. We hear, frankly, ridiculous arguments from both sides. How you're going to undo NAFTA or stop the process of globalization. We have grassroots forces that are feeling the forces of destruction and don't immediately realize the benefits of creation. But what we have done as a society and what makes America unique, Frank, is that we are masters of creative destruction.